we can talk.
Okay.
Sounds good. Everyone's silent.
Okay, so we're live now. And this time we're live, Craig. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, everyone. I don't know from where you're coming from the world. We have a very special meetup today. We have the Auckland Connected Systems User Group, the Auckland Azure User Group, and NotShore.NET User Group coming together to bring Thiago Almeida and Michael Collier all the way from the US. And a special thanks for them, because I just realized this morning that today is also a Memorial Day. So they're doing that not only on a Monday for them, but on a holiday, right, at night. So extra thanks for that, guys. We're going to give another 2 minutes or so to start, and then I can introduce the show for today. We have in the line Thiago, then Scott Rainford from the Azure, the Auckland Azure User Group. We have Michael Collier, Craig Hayden from ACSUG, and Alessandro from ACSUG as well. So if you guys want to say hi, feel free to open your microphone, everyone.
Let the chaos begin. G'day, everyone.
Yes.
Welcome to the group.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be back, I guess, albeit remotely. I wish I was there in person.
Well, we can do that at some time. We just need to make sure that we know when you're here, mate.
Will do.
If I get there, I'm going with Thiago so you can show me all the good places to eat and drink. I gotta get there.
Once they've opened, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
All right. They're all open here, actually.
Yeah, but they wouldn't let us get there.
That's true. For now. All right. So let's start for now, and then we can come back and talk a little bit more. So about the user groups, as I said today, we have the Auckland Connected System User Groups. And that user group is focused on integration and lately on cloud and hybrid integration. We also have the Auckland Azure User Group. Dan, you want to talk quickly about that one?
Yeah, so that's another user group. We run that usually every second Wednesday of the month, and we generally focus on infrastructure, but anything to do with Azure really we cover.
Awesome. And the NotShore.NET user group that focus on .NET, but lately, because everything is converging to the cloud, is also connecting, working on Azure and the development items on that. Unfortunately, Rory couldn't join us, but he's one of the organizers of that user group. Today's show, what we have here is networking for Azure Functions. It's for serverless devs too, right? It's going to be presented by Thiago Almeida, that is the Principal Software Development Engineer Lead at the CSC, and CSC stands for, Thiago?
Commercial Software Engineering.
There we go.
I'll talk a little
Microsoft.
bit more about it later.
And Michael, there is the principal, Michael Collier, there is Principal Software Dev Engineer at the same group. So they work together on that one. Craig hates when I say that, but I created the SCSUG Legends when he lost or missed the meeting for the first time for Things Forever. I think he managed to go to every single meeting that Connected System User Groups created, apart from one. And that was the one where I created those legends, right? The legends that we have today is that first, Thiago is back for the user group that he created ages ago. How long ago, Craig?
Oh, geez, what were we talking? Almost 9 years, Thiago?
So it's
something like that, 9-10 years.
Well, how long you been in US? Too hard at
five, almost 6 years.
Yeah. So and I remember that thing running for at least another 2 or 3, so ages ago, right? And the other one is probably the an actual record for the number of user groups running the same event together, right? 3 user groups running the same event together, which is a first. Hopefully, you're going to have more of those going later. Just let me come back to my screen here. I'll put myself. Okay, so I'll ask Michael and Thiago to share their screen now, and then we can start from there.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks,
so just let me send that on live.
Cool. There we go.
And you guys are ready to go.
Great. Thanks, Wagner. Again, it's Thiago here. It's great to have been invited to present to you. When Wagner had this idea, it's unfortunate that we're not there in person delivering this session, but I think what's happening now in the world kind of caused us to try and do this remotely, which is working out great for today. The session that we have is an idea about covering the networking options for Azure Functions, and especially for functions in the premium tier, the Elastic premium tier of Azure Functions. It's a tier of Azure Functions that has been aimed at more enterprises requirements, and that part of it is networking. And we had the agenda plan is 15 minutes of intro, and then I'll talk a little bit about Azure Functions and the hosting options that we have there, just so that you can see where Premium Functions sits with the rest of it. And then we're gonna go deeper, and Michael especially is gonna go pretty deep into the networking options for Premium Functions, including a couple of demos there. Then finally, Q&A, and I told Wagner if there's any burning questions that come through and relevant to what we're presenting right now, then feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll be able to cover them as well. All right, like I mentioned before, both Michael and I work in a team inside of Microsoft called Commercial Software Engineering. It's an organization that's global. There's a presence worldwide. And we are formed into multiple teams that will work directly with customers. And we're not in a product group, so we're not building Azure Functions, but we work a lot with customers, trying to bring them onto Azure or get their solution developed on Azure. And we help them both all the way from architecture through implementation and getting the code production ready for them to then take on and deploy themselves to production. And we code with them, so it's usually part our team, part the customer team together, developing the solution. And as part of that, we learn quite a lot of things that work, things that don't work, some best practices, and also bring a lot of feedback to the product groups as well. And most of CSE is dev crews that will work on projects with customers. But we have some teams that cut across everything in solution areas, and our solution area is serverless and messaging. And that's why we're presenting to you today, is because we have a strong focus on that. And the presenters again, I'm Thiago Almeida, if you want to follow me there on Twitter, and Z Thiago from when I lived in New Zealand. And Michael, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Michael Collier. I am on Thiago's team at Microsoft in Commercial Software Engineering. All my social networks are there, so GitHub, Twitter, and my blog at michaelscollier.com. Looking forward to today.
Cool. All right. So this is my take. I think I wanted to cover Azure Functions a little bit. It's more popular and well known for being a serverless offering on Azure. But I see it as a couple of different things. The first one is that it's a runtime and programming model. So the Azure Functions team will provide to you a host runtime where you can, when you create a function solution, that function host runtime is what is going to execute and host it for you. Functions core tools, so those are the main tools that you're going to use to run them locally, deploy them to Azure, and etc. The functions triggers and bindings and extensions, so that is the part of the programming model itself of Azure Function, where you can trigger based on multiple events, like a blob was put into blob storage, an HTTP event came in, a timer trigger has gotten to the time change feed happened into Cosmos DB, an event create event happened, and etc. So those are the triggers. And then you also have input and output bindings that you can take advantage of. So that's also part of the runtime and programming model, as well as dev tooling. So VS Code extensions, Visual Studio extensions, Maven, and others. And then finally, also some base Docker images for you to use. If you want to follow the path of containerizing your Azure Functions, then there's images that they provide to you that you can use as a starting point for your solution. So that's one thing, that's one part of Azure Functions, and that alone is great. But also, it is a serverless PaaS offering, so it's what it's well known for, and it has consumption and elastic premium tiers now in the serverless area. So taking that runtime and programming model and deploy that's hosted and run by Microsoft for you on Azure. The consumption tier, it's event-based, so the scale will happen based on the number of events that you're getting. You pay per execution or pay per usage. It has some fixed underlying virtual machine sizes, so underlying worker sizes, I should say, and it doesn't have any virtual networking options. And it has a max duration for the execution of your functions. And then Microsoft decided to, the functions team noticed, the feedback from a lot of enterprises that required unlimited durations, VNET integration options, larger worker sizes, and etc. So they and no code start and etc. So they created Elastic Premium, and that is the same as consumption as far as event-based and pay per usage, but there is a minimum number of one that you have to run of a worker. And you can say, I want to start already with always having a minimum reserved instances. And this one has VNet options, which is what Michael and I are going to cover the rest of the session. And also, it doesn't have a specified max duration for your functions. So now if you think about how Azure Functions is a runtime and programming model as well, you can take that and then deploy it to multiple other locations as well. So you could put it on an existing app service plan that you have because you already have, say, web apps running, and you want to just take advantage of the same workers there. And also, if you have an app service environment, which is a dedicated into your VNet, deployed into your virtual network app service, you can deploy your functions there. Or you can take that runtime and programming model onto other Azure, especially AKS, so with Kubernetes, or self-hosted on virtual machines. And that gives you a lot more control, but also a lot more responsibility. But you have full control over the isolation of the compute there. Or finally, you can move it to other clouds, especially that's the path that it's going towards, is being able to deploy it outside of Azure and be managed through Arc or not. So that's this whole spectrum here, where you have serverless offerings where it's the best place and it's hosted by Microsoft, scaled for you and paid per usage on consumption and premium. And then if you want to keep using the runtime and programming model because you like it, it has several advantages with all the tooling that you get, then you can put that on app service plan, app service environment, other Azure, and then even outside of Azure. That's how I think about it when I think about Azure Functions, where publicly it's very popular as being a serverless offering, but to me it's a little more than that. The programming model and the runtime is a big thing that is also portable. It's becoming more and more portable as the team works on it. So now I'll probably hand over to Michael, and the one last thing I wanted to say about that is that, like I mentioned, the premium functions offering is one that takes a lot of the enterprise requirements, and those are the customers that we work with the most, or more often than not. And They have several different types of requirements. Of course, no customer is the same as the other. One constant requirement that we see is they have either things on premises through networking setup that they have with either ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPNs, or they have things inside of VNet already, and they want to make sure to either secure the function to only call things in the VNet, or get things in the VNet to be able to call your function only, or a combination of all of that, or block access to your function from outside from the public. And a lot of those, as you can see here, are not possible with consumption plan, which they then made possible with premium. So it's kind of a best of both worlds between the isolation that you got and the virtual networking features that you got from either app service or app service environment, but with the consumption features of scale as needed with a larger number of workers behind the scenes scaling up and down for you. Cool. So with that, that's my intro and my view of things. I'll hand over to Michael to start taking us through the virtual networking features of premium functions.
Awesome. Thanks, Thiago. So before we get into some of the details and some of the demos, I wanted to quickly go over some of the terminology that I'll talk about today, just because I think it can get a little confusing. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of the key terms we're going to be talking about. Starting off with inbound IP address restrictions. So when we're talking about inbound IP address restrictions, it's really saying you have an Azure function that you want to invoke, but you want to restrict it. Actually, you want to restrict who can invoke that to a set of IP addresses. So it's kind of like an allow list, an IP allow list. Only allow this set of IP addresses to invoke that function. We talk about private site. What we're talking about with private site is really setting up a service endpoint for that function. So it's very similar to access restrictions, except you are allowing now someone that traffic to invoke that function that can come from within your virtual network. So it could be, I have a VM that I need to invoke an Azure function. I can use a service endpoint or private site to allow that to happen. Very similar setup from the public internet. Now it's just addresses within your virtual network. We're going to VNET integration, kind of going the other way. You're saying I have this Azure function and I want it to be able to access resources within my virtual network. So I want it to say I want to get to a SQL database or Azure Blob Storage or a Cosmos DB instance. So that function can now talk to effectively resources within that virtual network. And one of the newer ones that's just now in preview is private endpoints. And they put inbound there because this is private endpoints inbound. It's very similar in a sense to private site in a way that you're allowing access from only within that virtual network. But the big difference with private endpoints is you get a private IP address that is associated to your virtual network. So it's coming from a subnet within that virtual network. So you have like a 10 dot something or 172 dot something IP address that is associated to this Azure function. When we talk about functions, I want to go over a little bit on how you can achieve that multi-tenant virtual network isolation. So we look here at a premium plan, and you can come at how you kind of control access to this from a couple of different ways. You can restrict inbound traffic using your triggers and how you access those triggers, either via service endpoints or private endpoints coming from the Azure Private Link service. And then you get the code, and then you start figuring out, okay, well, now that I have controlled inbound, how do I control outbound traffic? And I can do things that you would normally associate with a kind of an infrastructure setup, right? User-defined routes or UDRs, virtual network integration, allowing me to talk to things within my virtual network, and network security groups. And that network security group could have something like allowing access to Azure services via service tags, network service tags, or saying something to effect that I want to block outbound internet traffic. So if it's destined for the internet, I want to block it there at that NSG rule and saying I'm not going to allow anything to go out. Now let's take a quick look at kind of how functions is built up and what people typically see and how we start adding in network controls to that. And then we'll get to a couple of demos. So you see in this example here, it's a very basic Azure function. There's no network kind of restrictions on it. You have an HTTP client that is invoking your actual function. You get a response back. Pretty straightforward. What actually is happening though, when you peel back it a little bit, is there's a load balancer. Azure has a load balancer in place. That load balancer is taking your request, routing it onto the function app, that function app sits on a VM that has a network interface card, a NIC on it that goes to the internet and then routes the traffic back and forth. In reality, though, it is a multi-tenant service. There's multiple clients hitting that same load balancer, and that load balancer is routing traffic to the appropriate function apps behind the scenes. But what you can do when you start to want to get network isolation in place is one option is to put that client within a virtual network. And so now that client sits in a virtual network and is accessing the load balancer and going through to hit your function app. And that is eventually we call like access restrictions or a service endpoint or a private site. You'll see in a lot of documentation, private site and service endpoint being the same thing. So take a look here at a demo, and I just want to show the diagram of what you're going to see when we go through this. So what I've set up is an Azure virtual network with 2 subnets. There's a VM in that subnet, and then there is the Azure Bastion service as well, which is allowing us access to that virtual machine. If I tried to hit or access this Azure function from my desktop, I would be denied access to it because this function has a service endpoint or private site control on it that says only allow traffic from within my virtual network. So if I was to access the VM via the Azure Bastion host, I could then get access to that Azure function. And if you want to see a tutorial on this, I have it on my blog, and also a slightly modified version of my blog is now in the Azure documentation. And you can get either of those links will get you to the same effective endpoint. So I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint here for just a second. Whoops, back up. And let's stop this. Get over the portal. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to stop my video as well, just to try to save a little bandwidth on my Teams here. All right, hopefully the portal is up. So this is the one on private site, just to show a couple of things here on how that is set up. I'm going to go into the Azure function that I've created. And we're going to go into the networking section. And we're going to look at access restrictions. And there's an access restriction on this one that says, I'm going to allow only traffic from the VNet called my VNet and the subnet, and that is enabled. So we're going to allow traffic from this particular VNet and subnet, and then denying everything else. So if I was to go to this, actually, let me go back and just show you. Okay, so it's ACSUG Func 02. That's the function app we're hitting. This is the typical hello world kind of function app that you get from the tutorials. See the URL there matches. And if I was to try to hit this from my browser, it is, you can hopefully see refreshing, it is not coming up. We get a 4034 bit and don't have access to it. Now I have a VM called my VM, this one here, and I've already logged into that VM just to save a little bit of time. So we're going into the Azure Bastion service here to get to this VM. So I'm just going to copy the same address that didn't work. And if I paste it into here, we should see that it does work. And I just to kind of prove it out a little bit, I'll do a name equals Michael. It's a typical Azure function you would see. So it's from within that virtual machine on that virtual network, I can get access and invoke this function using the same URL I would expect to hit. But outside of that virtual network, I do not have access to the function.
And Michael, these IP restrictions, you could use, say, if you want to front your function with something else on Azure, like we've seen with customers that use API management on standard and above, you get a dedicated IP address, and you could restrict it just to that IP of API management, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yep.
And then let API management do everything that it does, like the policies that it can apply, the more advanced auth with certificates, all that stuff.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Access restriction gives you a lot of kind of fun things you can put in here, add different rules. One thing I'll point out with this setup as well is there is the SCM endpoint within Azure Functions. That's kind of the deployment endpoint. And I could put VNet restrictions on that as well. For this particular example, I have not put any sort of restrictions on this one that allows, by not doing that, it allows me very easy to deploy from my desktop if I wanted to deploy that, right? There's no restrictions there. If I did put any sort of restrictions on this SCM endpoint, then I maybe say I don't want to allow access, or I only want to allow access from within that virtual network. I would need some sort of agent on that. So if I was using Azure DevOps, I might need like a build agent within that virtual network to be able to publish to this. So you can give all sorts of kind of fun rules on how you want to allow or deny traffic. All good with that one? Good. Cool. All right, let's keep on moving. So another thing to talk about is private endpoints. And private endpoints inbound here, that's available in preview right now. It's in 2 regions, and it's slowly rolling out throughout the preview process to all available Azure regions here, hopefully in the near future. But this allows you to get that dedicated private IP address from within your virtual network. And then so you can connect to that private IP address from whatever client you're on, and then routing through it as well. And we'll take off these other clients just to clean up the picture a little bit. So as we go through here, we can see we can also do is add VNET integration. That's available for Windows now, and Linux is in preview, and then VGA here in the not too distant future as well. And what this allows you to do is route that connection into your function app, hits the function app, and VNET integration says, hey, I want to actually inject myself sort of into my virtual network to allow that NIC to get into the network to access any other Azure resources that may be bound to that virtual network. So maybe I have a Cosmos DB instance or Azure storage that has service endpoints on it or private endpoints. I say only allow traffic from within my virtual network to talk to, say, Azure storage. VNET integration allows me to get access from my function to those network controlled or network restricted resources. And then I can still go outbound to the internet as well. There's nothing blocking that, right? It's just allowing me, hey, just get into resources within that virtual network. If I want, I can add additional networking options that I might want to do with maybe a VM or any sort of networking rules as well. Maybe something like a user-defined route. So I can put a UDR in place to control how that routing works, so they're not going out through the public NIC that's there, but I want to go through some UDRs and maybe some other kind of rules in place on how I want to route that traffic. You can certainly do that. You can also add network security groups. We'll see an example of that coming up here in a minute as well. Network security groups, I could deny traffic out to the public internet altogether if that's what I wanted to do. So I could say I want to get access to things in my virtual network, but if I'm destined for, yahoo.com, then we're not going to get there. We're not going to allow that to happen. We'll take a look at that in a demo here. So just to set up what we're going to see in the demo, we're going to have a Azure function that's set up with VNET integration, and it's going to inject itself into a particular subnet. That subnet has an NSG, a network security group rule in place. That rule is like for any port, any protocol, if it's coming from the virtual network and it's destined for the internet, we're going to deny that traffic. So before this is all set up, you would expect that any sort of request going to the internet would actually work. But what you do to make this kind of happen is you add a special Azure app setting called website VNet routes all and set that value equal to 1. And what that app setting is doing is effectively saying, hey, Azure Functions, I want you to route all traffic into the virtual network. And once all traffic is routed into the virtual network, any NSG rules or user-defined routes, those start taking effect. Without this setting, you're not routing into the network. So this setting is key to get yourself into the network for any network security rules that you might want to be in place. So we'll switch over to the portal again. I'm going to close some of our previous windows since we don't need them anymore, and go over to this one here on controlling internet access. So this is an Azure function set up as premium plan. We've got an NSG rule here. And just to show what is in this NSG rule, we have a couple of outbound rules in place. Let's click on outbound rules just to make that screen a little bit easier. So we have some defaults in place, and we added 3 custom ones. We have one that says disable internet outbound. So anything that is destined, that starts on our virtual network and is destined for the internet, we're going to deny. We're also setting up a couple allow rules in here to allow app insights to work. So I'm going to switch over to that one here. And we're going to go to turn on, make sure live metrics is on so we can kind of see what's happening. And all this API is doing, this is not doing much of anything at all. It's making an HTTP request from within the Azure function out to the HTTP status website. So it should give back a HTTP status of 200. And I've got an extension in here, the REST extension in Visual Studio Code, to allow me just to simply click on send request to make that happen. So do send request, and we get back a response here of HTTP status. So that's all good. I might do that a few more times just to kind of prove out that that's working. That's working, and we're getting, if we look in App Insights, we can see we're getting a couple of calls in here as well. We're getting some logging happening. So that's good. So I'm going to close this, and we're going to make one small change. We're going to add this rule here that you see on lines 25. I'm going to hit Control single quote on this. I have a Azure CLI extension that allows me to essentially at the end of a line just hit Control single quote that to essentially copy and paste that line. You'll see it show up down here at the bottom of my terminal. So go ahead and do that. And this will take a few seconds for this to work. It's going to update the app setting. It's going to add the website VNet route all, setting the value to 1. And when that happens, if you've gone through the portal and done this yourself, you'll notice that you'll get a prompt in the portal that the site's actually going to do a restart. What we'll see here in Application Insights happening is you'll see this logging is starting to slowly kind of trickle off. And this one server online will change to 0 servers online as App Insights says essentially kind of has to reset itself to get access back into App Insights now that we're kind of changed its routing rules. Now it takes a couple seconds for that to work, but let's go ahead and try this again. So if everything is working right, and I didn't screw up anything, I should be able to hit send request again, and it'll take a couple of seconds for it to time out, probably about 15 to 20 seconds, maybe a little longer for that to time out. Let's go ahead and try that. So you just hit that, and you see now down here at the bottom, it is waiting. And we can look here, see that we're getting our logging back in place. We see one server is online, so App Insights is now connecting back again, so that's good. Let this wait, and then we did here timeout, right? We got a timeout error, the connection was reset. And we can see some exceptions coming in place with App Insights as well. We were able to, that request did get timed out. So what we did there is, before we didn't have any rules in place. We had rules in place, but nothing was actually forcing the traffic into the virtual network in order for those NSG rules to take effect. But by setting website VNet route all to 1, we've effectively pushed all traffic into the virtual network. And because that network and subnet have NSG rules that block anything destined for the internet, that we were denied access to the HTTP status website, but our App Insights is still up and running because we had the service tags in there to allow that to happen. So with that, let's start talking about how we can actually work with premium functions and VNet integration to trigger off of resources that are within the virtual network. And by default, Azure Functions has a scale controller, which is querying and interacting with anything you might want to trigger on, like Cosmos DB or Azure Storage or Service Bus, those sort of things, and making decisions that help Azure Functions scale out. And that scale controller normally is sitting outside the virtual network, and it can reach out and talk to any sort of resources just fine. But what happens when that resource is bound to the virtual network and has a private endpoint on it? The scale controller is unable to reach into the virtual network to get access to resources that have a private endpoint. Remember that private endpoint for this example here, Cosmos DB will have a 10.something IP address, for example. It has an internal IP address to that virtual network. So what you need to do is, and if you're looking at the Azure portal view, normally the setting is off. This VNet trigger support setting is off. You can change that setting to on. And when that happens, you're moving the scale controller onto one of the already warmed instances of the premium function, the premium app service plan that's there. And what that allows it to do, since now the scale controller is on the same instance as the function, one of the premium instances, it's able to use the VNet integration that you've set up and route that connection into the virtual network to the private endpoint to start seeing what's going on with that resource. And this is supported on a subset of the triggers. So right now it is on storage, Event Hub, Service Bus, Cosmos DB, and durable task if you're using durable functions. So not every trigger supports this, but these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right there, 5 of them actually make this actually work. And we'll show an example of this here with this diagram. I want to talk through this just a little bit. So in this example here, what we're trying to set up is an Azure function that has VNet integration enabled, getting access to the virtual network and a subnet, anything there in it. And one of the interesting things with Azure Functions is how it handles storage accounts. And normally there is an Azure Web Job storage account, and that handles some metadata about the function's runtime environment and any triggers, and the content for your application can go there as well. But if you wanted to say, I want to restrict everything to the virtual network, I want to put Azure Web Job storage behind virtual network controls, I may have another Azure Blob storage account that I want to use to put maybe files into that I can trigger off of, and maybe I want to get access to Cosmos DB. I want all those to have private endpoints on them. You can do all of that almost. The only thing you can't lock down or restrict to the virtual network today is the Azure file share that is referenced by the application content. There's a web content file share, web application content file share connection string app setting. That connection string, instead of pointing to what may be your same storage account used by Azure Web Job Storage, will need to point to an Azure storage account that does not have any restriction, any VNet restrictions on it. Okay, so that enables the functions kind of controllers to grab and mount that file share to the premium instance. Everything else you'll see in the diagram is sitting behind private endpoints. I have a VM and Azure Bastion set up in the virtual network to allow me to access these resources. And because it's private endpoints, there are several Azure private DNS zones in place that allow the connections to kind of route to the private 10. or 172. IP addresses that you'll see.
And that's a temporary limitation, as I understand it, right?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yep, that is a temporary limitation. The functions team is working on removing that limitation in the future. So when that is done here, hopefully in the next few months, that will allow you to say, I have an Azure storage account, and I want to make that have a private endpoint on it, and that I don't have to do any sort of this kind of setting up 2 different storage accounts to make this work. I say, here's my storage account that handles all my Azure files, or all my resources for the Azure function, right? And just to show some of that, kind of where all this is kind of living right now, let me show a couple of different things. Let's look in here at my function. And I'll quickly click through the configuration section here. So the important things here is Azure Web Job Storage. And let's make this a little bit bigger. It's referencing a storage account that ends in WJSA. All right. I've got another storage account here called Census Results Azure Storage Connection. And that's ending in PE. This one has a private endpoint on it. There's some Cosmos stuff in here. We're going to put some, basically the idea with this demo is going to be picking up faked census data from Azure Blob Storage and sending it out to Cosmos. And here's this website content Azure file connection string. And this is pointing to a separate storage account that ends in AC. A couple other important app settings here to make all this work. One is, this one should look familiar, website VNet route all. So again, we're going to force traffic into the virtual network. And the other thing you need to do to make private endpoints work, excuse me, to allow an Azure function to work with private endpoints is to set this website DNS server. That is allowing Azure Functions to use a DNS server that Azure is hosting. And this is in the docs of what this IP address is. You put that in place, that'll allow you to resolve and start working with the private DNS zones that are in place. All right, so with that, let's look at some of the storage accounts just to show what all is here as well. So I'm again on my box. I'm going to look at the private endpoint one. This is one of the ones that has a private endpoint on it. If I go into Storage Explorer and try to access this, I can see that there's a container called census results, but when I try to access it, I don't have access to do so. And the same if I try to look at files, right? I'm unable to load any of that data. But I have the application content one. This one again has no VNet restrictions in place on it. And I can see here my file shares that there is a file share that you would see when you logged in to the box and look at the share that Azure Premium Functions mounts. We have a VM in place here as well. So I'm going to go to this VM. And remember, this Azure function is picking up from Azure Blob Storage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a file into this census results folder, or container, excuse me. And it should show up, about 4 records should show up in this Census 2020 Cosmos DB collection as well. I'll refresh it here to show that there's nothing in there. So I'm going to take this sample CSV file, and we're just going to drag this CSV file in here. You can see it is starting to work. So that has been completed. So now we've uploaded that CSV file. We'll go over here, and if everything works right, should get our files. So the blob trigger wakes up. Let me try the Azure portal. Did something?
It might take a while for the file to be picked up by the blob trigger.
That trigger times out after a while.
So there's a exponential back off when there's nothing there for it to pick up.
I will come back. So that make people watch clicking on this. I see the time. We'll come back to this after we're done to get the next couple of slides, and hopefully that has picked up if it hasn't picked up yet. All right, cool. We'll come back to that in just a second. All right, so moving on to the next one. So that talked about premium functions and some of the things you can do with premium functions. But if you don't want to set up a premium function and you want more to completely lock it down, don't want to worry about VNet integration, the other option to get that network isolation is to set up an app service environment. You can set up an internally load balanced app service environment. And what you're doing there is putting everything within inside that virtual network. So you don't need to worry about VNet integration and setting up certain app setting rules like the DNS server and the VNet or the website VNet route all, because now you're inside the virtual network already. So to kind of compare it, you can do premium functions, an Azure Premium plan, or an app service environment. With premium functions, you configure virtual network integration and set up your service endpoints or private endpoints. But you do still have that DNS endpoint that's available, right? Your something.azurewebsites.net. With an app service environment, it's deployed into that virtual network, and there is no DNS endpoint to hit, right? This is completely behind the virtual network with the ILB, internally load balanced ACE. In either case, you still have to set up any of your virtual network features like network security groups or user-defined routes. That all has to be in place, and you still have to set up anything else that you might want to interact with, right? If you're setting up Cosmos DB, you would still need to set up any of the service endpoints or private endpoints with those. I'm going to click back here to see if this thing is refreshed yet. Hey, there it goes. Whew, scared for a minute. I broke something. So at that point, yeah, so you can see there we got a few records in there, and those should match up with what we have in our file as well. So Michael, Sonia, Aiden, Logan, there's Aiden in there. All right, so that works, so that's good. Let's switch back over to the slides here. All right, and if you want to find out any of this anything that you saw on here as far as the demos, go. I have 2 of them up on my blog at michaelscollier.com. And I put together Azure CLI scripts for the private site sample and the NSG sample. I put them up last night on my GitHub page, so you can find those there if you wanted to run through it yourself. The GitHub repos for those are pretty basic right now, but at least the CLI scripts to run them are available. And there is a blog post I put together on private storage, or kind of private endpoints. And there's an ARM template available for that as well, and a GitHub page that shows you a quick start template at how to set up premium functions with VNET integration and how you can help automate all of that. There's a couple of good docs here. I would highly encourage, if you're interested in learning more about functions and what you can do with networking, to look at this functions networking options one. It's a pretty long page, but it does give you a lot of the detail you would need to the various options on how functions works with virtual networks and routing rules and DNS and those sort of things. So with that, I think those are most of my demos. I think any questions we need to go through?
Ooh, I think we covered most of them, but there is a new one here just asking about comparing ACE and private link.
Comparing ACE and private link. So
Yeah.
as I understand it, private link's the service that powers private endpoints. So I can have an app service environment that would sit inside that virtual network. But if I wanted something like Cosmos DB to only be accessible from within that virtual network, I could put a private endpoint via the private link service onto that. And that Cosmos DB would then have an IP address that is associated or sourced from my virtual network. So instead of, I have like a 10 dot something IP address. So the ACE would have to have DNS rules to know how to communicate with that. So instead of hitting contoso.docs or contoso.database.windows.net or whatever the Cosmos DB URI normally is, you still hit that, but there would be some DNS rules that instead of hitting the normal public Cosmos DB instance, it would route to your 10 dot whatever instance. So as you're kind of bypassing that through some DNS zones and rules to make that connection work. So you hit the right place. So they could go together, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that the slide that you had, I think 1 or 2 slides before, that talks about ACE or premium functions, that's the best one to look at from a comparison perspective where, yeah, that one. So this is a better comparison, I believe, where if you want the networking features, you can go with premium plan. If you still want the elastic scale and the paper execution, but if you need full completely isolation deployed into your virtual network without needing to configure virtual networking and private endpoints, then an app service environment starts to make sense. It'll take a longer to deploy, and if you need to scale up and down, it's a manual process, or at least you can configure it for auto scaling, but it'll take a little longer to add and remove the workers. And it's also because it's a dedicated environment, you'd have to compare well the price as well, because with premium functions, you're paying per execution, so you're paying exactly for what you're using. But this is a good page to compare the two, I believe.
Yep, good point.
Was someone going to ask a question? I might have jumped in before in front of someone.
No, Thiago, I was just mentioning the question that you just answered.
Okay, cool. I hope that made sense. Otherwise, we can connect some more.
It made sense to me. Yeah, there's like that comparison between having the elasticity of the consumption plan, but also the ability to connect and to lock into the virtual network is what makes the premium plan compelling. While if you wanted a full isolated from the get-go, and actually if it's not thinking just about the functions, that's where the ASC might come into place.
Got it. And we do have, Michael, maybe we can show the next slide just because it has the links to the slides. We just created that aka.ms link before the meeting here. So it's in inception where the presentation is talking about where to get the presentation. But if you want to go through the slides and download it, that link there should work. Again, if you want to get in touch with us, with Michael or myself, we're both on Twitter pretty actively. So if you have any follow-up questions there, if we don't know the answer, we'll find out from the product group and other folks. And of course, Wagner and Craig and Daniel and Alessandro can also help with questions. And as you can see, Premium Functions itself is super powerful, especially now with this virtual networking integration. But I'd read more about it as well if you have enterprises where you want to create some complex infrastructure, complex architectures that could take advantage of Azure Functions. I know, for example, Michael was working with a client, a large company that had distribution centers and etc., and they needed some isolation into virtual networking, but they wanted the elasticity that they could get from Premium Functions, and this was becoming a very interesting feature for them to use in the overall architecture. So more and more we're seeing it being used by corporates and enterprises for that reason.
Most definitely.
And unfortunately, you might notice we didn't have like customer specific architectures and etc. And that's mostly because the companies we work with don't allow us to talk about the projects. But like I mentioned at the beginning, we do get pretty hands-on. So we have used this in a few projects with customers in production.
That's cool.
Yeah, and I think as we progress, we'll probably generalize a few of the architectures that are repeating, and then just present those as a generic architecture. I think that would make for a nice presentation in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. And even for the guidance on Microsoft Docs.
Yeah, the architecture center. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's something I've been working a lot with the functions team on, is kind of beefing up or kind of cleaning up some of the Azure Functions and networking documentation, especially around like adding stuff for automation or putting in more tutorials on how to do some of this stuff. Right, like private site tutorial came from that. I think we'll probably work with the docs team to do something around private endpoints maybe as well. If not, linking to my blog directly, or do something with the tutorial to make kind of all this light up. Especially once the ability to have the application content file share, once that setting is now kind of pushed behind the virtual network as well, I think that the story has become really interesting there, making it a lot easier to set up with private endpoints.
Michael, Thiago, do you see a few customers getting in and using KEDA with Azure Functions? Is that something you're seeing a bit of?
Yeah. Especially there's certain customers where they have a cloud of excellence center with architects that are deciding some places for the company to focus on, and they basically ask that everybody deploys their solutions to AKS, for example, or make it Kubernetes friendly because they needed the same solution to be on Azure and outside of Azure, and Kubernetes helps with that side. And if the company is okay with introducing more of that complexity into the architecture, we are seeing some customers that definitely move the code, still using the Azure Functions runtime, and that's part of what I covered at the beginning, where you can still take the functions code, put it into containers, and then use KEDA to do a similar type of scaling of the pods in AKS. Or other Kubernetes solutions up and down for you based on the same event type scaling that you get with the function scaler.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, we have, I think one current project we have is doing log aggregation of network security devices that are all coming in from all of those, and then they eventually land into event hubs with Kafka, and then functions inside of Kubernetes pods as being scaled by Kata up and down to translate all of those into a canonical format for the logs that then the company will take and analyze, for example. So that's one example where I've seen the company using Kata for the scaling up and down the pods. And of course, you don't need Azure Functions with Kata. You can use it on its own just to scale your pods, as long as what's in your pod is what's processing what Kata is monitoring. So we had another one in Brazil, actually, a company there where they were using the same similar thing with event hubs, but they have their own Java-based processor code that was picking up from event hubs with Kafka and processing the events, but without the functions runtime itself. So they had already their own processor. And likewise, Kata was used to scale up and down the number of pods that were required to be able to cope with the amount of events that were coming into event hubs.
That's awesome. And I guess there's the Project Osiris as well, linking into that a little bit as well.
Do you know about that one, Michael? I'm not sure. I've heard about it.
The name sounds familiar, but I'm not familiar with the details.
Or I think that was the one that did the 0 to 1, right?
Yes, that's the one. So
okay, yeah, now it rings a bell.
Yeah, it was one of the build announcements that was quite interesting. I think
yeah,
Microcenter mentioned in one of his keynotes.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna take next week off to catch up on build.
Well, when you do, you can come back and share this with all of us. That'd be fantastic.
I know Wagner just had a really good blog post that kind of summarizes all of the serverless and messaging based announcements, so that could be worth sharing as well.
Awesome.
Cool.
Hey, will we be
that's on my list.
The recording of this session, will we be making this available?
Yes, I'm going to have that on the ACSUG playlist, but also make sure that you have a copy to push it onto the Auckland Azure playlist that we just started last time.
Perfect. That'd be fantastic, guys.
Mm-hmm. So that's going out to our YouTube site, right, Wagner?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So you should have that in a couple of days. Should have that ready.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, it's a great, huge honor to be invited back to present and see some familiar faces, even if it's a few of them were just over questions and comments there. And I hope sometime in the future I'll be able to travel there and do this in person as well.
Yeah, thank you guys. As I said, I know there is a holiday for you guys. It's at night, so huge thanks for making the time and join us on the other side of the world on our own time zone. Mm-hmm.
This was the only meeting I had all day today, so that's great.
That's changing tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow's another day.
At least we didn't have any conflicts there.
Yeah, exactly.
So with that, I'm going to finish the recording for today. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. And this is going to be available soon. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.